When Vladimir Putin ordered the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he convinced himself that the war he was starting would be quick and straightforward. Russia would send in columns of tanks and tens of thousands of soldiers, Ukraine would collapse under the pressure, and the country would be forced to surrender on Moscow's terms. Even when that rapid victory failed to materialize, Putin assumed he still had the unwavering backing of his own population and that Russia could gradually grind Ukraine down over time through sheer attrition and brutality. What he did not anticipate was that some of his own people, as well as Ukrainians in the occupied territories, would turn against him and open a second front that he could not control. That is exactly what is now happening across occupied Ukraine and inside Russia itself. Resistance movements are teaching Putin that he can never know where the next blow will land. While the world watches the visible front lines, a hidden and chaotic war has erupted on Russian-controlled territory and inside Russia, and this is a war that Putin is steadily losing. In a report published on December 2nd, Euromaidan Press describes how Russia is facing a serious and growing problem with underground resistance movements. Operating from the shadows and constantly watching for opportunities to strike, these movements are made up of Ukrainians in temporarily occupied regions of their own country and Russians who have chosen to fight against Putin on his home turf. They are dangerous, effective, and have carried out attacks inside Russia that the Kremlin and its conventional army are almost powerless to stop. Even Russia's own security and intelligence services appear unable to contain the growing wave of attacks, which now stretches from Melitopol to Moscow, according to Euromaidan Press. The danger for Putin is not only that Russian territory is being hit, but that the pattern of attacks suggests a level of coordination that points to an underground network so extensive that it has become nearly impossible to stamp out. A cluster of partisan strikes throughout November revealed the true scale of this resistance network, and the story begins in Melitopol. Euromaidan Press reports that a local partisan group tried to blow up a vehicle transporting a Russian drone team as they drove to take part in an operation. In that instance, the car bomb failed to detonate properly, and the drone crew survived, making it one of the few failed attempts by Ukrainian resistance fighters in the city. Yet that failure does not change the bigger picture. Melitopol, which has been under Russian occupation almost from the earliest days of the invasion, has become a major hub of resistance activity. As far back as October 2023, saboteurs demonstrated that the car bombing tactic could work there, successfully detonating an explosive that killed several occupying Russian personnel. At the time, the Express reported on the incident, noting that Russian officials tried to pass it off as an accident caused by a short circuit. In reality, it was a deliberate partisan operation, one of many that have been conducted over the last 2 years. Russia's authorities know they have a serious resistance problem in this region of Ukraine. In June, the outlet Pravda reported that the occupation administration announced the sentencing of an entire family from the area, accusing them of collaborating with Ukraine and organizing a railway sabotage operation. Those arrests and harsh sentences, ranging from 20 years in prison to life behind bars, were among the very few successes Russia has had in hunting down Ukrainian partisans in Melitopol. Even those draconian punishments did not deter others. The failed November car bombing may not have killed its intended targets, but it helped set the tone for a month of sabotage that Putin would soon prefer to erase from his memory. Only a few days later, saboteurs in another occupied region, Luhansk, carried out an operation with far more deadly results. In territory where Moscow claims to exercise almost total control, partisans managed to strike again. Underground fighters planted explosives beneath 2 Russian vehicles and detonated them at exactly the right moments. 4 Russian soldiers were killed in the explosions, demonstrating how deeply entrenched the partisan movement has become in areas that the Kremlin insists are fully integrated into Russia. The Luhansk operation in November strongly resembled another underground attack carried out months earlier in the Kherson region. In May, the Kyiv Independent reported that another car bomb killed 4 pro-Russian fighters, this time Chechen officers working for Russia in occupied territory. A clear pattern is emerging. These operations show that Ukrainian underground fighters have become adept at identifying priority vehicles and targets, and, even more importantly, at gaining access to them long enough to plant explosives that can kill Russian troops and collaborators with surgical precision. The list of operations in occupied Ukraine does not end there. In Crimea, infiltrators carried out a very different kind of mission. Euromaidan Press reports that Ukrainian agents managed to record Russian fighter jets taking off from Saki Air Base, providing Ukrainian intelligence with real-time insight into Russian flight patterns. Operations like this, which focus on reconnaissance and intelligence gathering, are just as vital as car bombings and sabotage that immediately kill enemy troops. By identifying exactly which aircraft are based at Saki, Ukraine can better anticipate which jets Russia can deploy in response to future Ukrainian attacks on the peninsula, including drone swarms or missile strikes. At the same time, these infiltrators give Ukraine highly specific future targets. It is entirely possible that a future successful Ukrainian drone and missile strike on Saki Air Base will be made possible by intelligence gathered during this mission. When viewed together, these clandestine operations reveal how they serve Ukraine's broader strategic goals. Every Russian vehicle that explodes, every car bomb that kills officers or soldiers, forces Russia to recalculate. Units that were supposed to participate in upcoming offensives suddenly find themselves short of key personnel. Commanders have to shuffle troops around to fill the gaps. If they fail to do so, the planned assault cannot proceed. If they succeed in moving troops, they weaken other sectors, which delays or cancels different operations. Either outcome is beneficial for Ukraine. The more often partisan actions succeed, the more disruption they cause across the Russian war machine. When those operations are combined with the type of intelligence gathering seen in Crimea, it becomes clear that Ukrainian intelligence services are closely coordinating with underground networks. These groups know exactly what information the Ukrainian armed forces need and how to pass it along, which would not be possible without a close relationship between organizations like HUR, Ukraine's military intelligence agency, and the partisans. All of this underscores how much bigger and more complex Putin's resistance problem is than he ever imagined. Even so, if the resistance activities were confined solely to occupied Ukrainian territory, Putin might regard them as a serious but manageable nuisance. He would still be infuriated, but he could rationalize that Ukrainians living under occupation would naturally attempt to sabotage logistics and disrupt military operations. His real nightmare is that the partisans are not limited to occupied Ukraine. They are operating inside Russia itself. That means some of Putin's own citizens are actively helping Ukraine by waging sabotage on Russian soil. During the same period in November, when the operations in Melitopol, Luhansk, Kherson, and Crimea took place, resistance groups inside Russia launched their own attacks. On November 5th, the Kiev Independent reported that Ukraine's Special Operations Forces, known as SSO, confirmed that a transport loading vehicle used for Iskander ballistic missiles had been destroyed in the Kursk region. The strike happened the day before, and notably, SSO did not carry it out directly. Instead, a Russian partisan group called Black Spark conducted the operation, significantly complicating Russia's ability to fire any of its stockpile of around 600 Iskander missiles at Ukraine from border areas. Euromaidan press adds that partisans, again presumed to be members of Black Spark, also destroyed a Harmonia radar system supporting local air defenses in the same region, apparently at roughly the same time. Here again, we see coordination and strategic thinking at work. Destroying the Iskander support vehicle undermines Russia's capacity to conduct missile strikes against Ukraine. Knocking out the radar weakens local air defenses, making it much harder for Russia to intercept Ukrainian drones and missiles in the area. That, in turn, opens up new opportunities for Ukrainian forces to exploit. With gaps in the radar coverage, Ukraine can fly more drones or missiles through the Kursk region toward high-value targets deeper inside Russia. Each of these attacks contributes to a broader strategy of weakening the Russian war effort from within. Just as the failed car bombing in Melitopol served as a warning sign of what was coming next in occupied Ukraine, the sabotage in Kursk marked the start of a new wave of covert operations inside Russia. Only 4 days after the Kursk operations were reported, Pravda wrote that Ukrainian partisans had destroyed 4 military logistics sites in Russia's Bashkortostan and Volgograd regions. In a series of arson attacks spanning October and continuing into November, partisans burned 3 communications towers in Bashkortostan and a railway relay cabinet in Volgograd. The target set in these operations could not be clearer. Russia relies heavily on its rail network to transport troops and equipment both across its vast territory and into Ukraine. Disabling a relay cabinet may cause only a temporary disruption, but even short interruptions can delay troop and equipment movements at critical moments, producing knock-on effects across the front. Meanwhile, destroying communications towers makes it more difficult for Russian forces to coordinate operations, even within their own borders, which ultimately weakens their capacity to wage offensive campaigns in Ukraine. These operations are not isolated anomalies. As Euromaidan press reports, Putin and his loyalists are facing a steadily intensifying wave of underground strikes for which they have no effective answer. In another sequence of incidents stretching from Moscow to Irkutsk, electrical panels, relay boxes, and railway infrastructure were set ablaze, with local authorities dismissing them as unexplained technical malfunctions. That official explanation captures how the Kremlin is choosing to respond. Instead of admitting that a growing underground resistance is sabotaging its infrastructure, the Russian government pretends the problem does not exist and expects the public to accept its narrative without question. Yet as sabotage becomes more frequent and more visible, it becomes increasingly difficult for Moscow to conceal the truth. Ukraine has developed a large and highly active network of supporters and resistance fighters inside Russia, and they are proving remarkably effective. The Moscow incidents are especially humiliating for Putin. Moscow is Russia's capital, and one would assume it is the most heavily monitored and protected city in the country, with the Kremlin dedicating enormous resources to catching saboteurs before they can strike. If that is true, those efforts are failing. On November 1st, the Kyiv Independent reported that Khor carried out a major drone strike against the Ring pipeline, a crucial piece of infrastructure that transports up to 3 million tons of jet fuel, as well as millions of tons of gasoline and diesel every day. The attack was carried out using drones, which suggests that local partisan groups were not the ones physically flying the aircraft. However, Euromaidan press connects the strike to infiltrators working inside Moscow. Those infiltrators may have played a role similar to the agents in Crimea, gathering photographs and precise information about the pipeline and relaying it to HUR, which then used that intelligence to plan the drone attack described by the Kyiv Independent. The truth is that nobody outside Ukraine's services can be certain exactly how it happened. Russia certainly does not know, and that uncertainty is itself a weapon. Putin is left raging and frustrated while he tries to work out how to counter elusive enemies he cannot see and cannot easily capture. What Putin refuses to acknowledge, despite the evidence in front of him, is that the core problem is not simply the existence of these underground groups. They have been present in some form since the early days of the invasion. The real problem is that they are expanding and becoming more sophisticated. The operations seen in November are more extensive and more frequent than those of the previous year. If this trend continues, today's sabotage and intelligence missions will look minor compared to what lies ahead. Resistance to Putin's rule has become a way of life for many people inside Russia, as Euromaidan press notes. The spread of sabotage from Moscow to the Ural region mirrors a broader rise in anti-government sentiment in various separatist and opposition circles. Yet in many cases, the driving motivation is no longer separatism or local autonomy. It is direct opposition to Putin's war on Ukraine. These are Russians who accept serious personal risks in order to strike at their own state. They are still relatively limited in number, but their actions are becoming more frequent and more impactful. A rare area that Moscow once considered safe is now increasingly exposed. If long-range drones and missiles are not striking refineries, then acts of sabotage carried out by Putin's own citizens are hitting rail lines, pipelines, and other parts of the war machine, threatening the entire Russian campaign. None of this should have surprised Putin. The warning signs were present years ago. In March 2024, journalist Ada Blakewell wrote an article for Vox Europe via Novaya Gazeta, in which she argued that Putin's focus on exiling, imprisoning, or killing high-profile critics of the regime had blinded him to the growth of real underground resistance. That resistance did not begin with bombs and arson. It started quietly. Early activists wore green ribbons and used online communities to express their outrage over Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Over time, Blakewell wrote, that well of discontent developed into something more organized. People who had once only worn symbols of protest began setting up clandestine workshops to support a growing sabotage movement. Online forums that had once hosted discussions became hubs for printing leaflets and underground publications exposing the reality of the war in Ukraine. Slowly but steadily, a movement was taking shape. Blakewell met some of these resistance members and described how they used tools like three-dimensional printing to manufacture equipment for their operations. Some members focused on cyber espionage or hacking, while others organized educational meetings and lectures. Many of them were not yet the people planting bombs or burning infrastructure, but they created the environment in which those future partisans could emerge. As Blakewell wrote in 2024, underground groups provided a safe refuge for people who wanted to oppose the regime without immediately sacrificing their freedom. It was only a matter of time before the most action-oriented members of these circles moved from theory and discussion to real-world sabotage. Putin either did not notice these developments or chose not to take them seriously. By February 2025, the consequences of that neglect were clear. Ukraine had helped foster a genuine shadow army inside the territories occupied by Russian forces. In February, the Atlantic Council wrote that an extensive network of civil resistance activists, partisan fighters, and special forces units was operating across all Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine from Crimea to Luhansk. This shadow army carried out propaganda campaigns, organized civil resistance, sabotaged infrastructure, and worked closely with Ukrainian military and intelligence services. These networks were expanding and integrating with HR and other agencies, making their operations increasingly effective. As we have already seen, similar movements were taking root inside Russia itself. Ukraine now effectively commands an army of people who are not formally part of its armed forces, yet who can carry out missions that regular units cannot. Ukrainian troops would have to break through heavily fortified front lines to strike deep inside regions like Melitopol or Luhansk. Partisans who already live there can inflict that damage from within. Russian citizens who support Ukraine do something similar inside Russia, hitting critical elements of the war machine in places Ukraine's regular army could not reach without launching a full-scale invasion. Once again, Putin did not act in time to prevent these movements from expanding. Now he is being forced to confront the reality that Ukraine holds the upper hand in this hidden war that is spreading across Russia and occupied Ukrainian territory. A November 27th analysis by Akled describes how the once isolated acts of sabotage inside Russia have evolved into something resembling a proxy war. The organization has tracked patterns of sabotage over the course of the conflict. During the first year, the majority of incidents consisted of arson attacks on military recruitment offices. Akled suggests that many of those early attacks may have had a self-interested component. A Russian conscript cannot be dragged into the army if the recruitment office that would process them has already been burned down. As time went on, however, both the nature of the attacks and the motivations behind them shifted. By 2025, Akled highlighted a partisan organization called Artesh as one of the primary forces behind Ukraine's shadow operations in the occupied territories. According to its analysis, Artesh was responsible for roughly half of the 30 sabotage operations carried out in those areas in that year alone. Inside Russia, groups such as the Freedom of Russia Legion were operating using similar tactics. Together with the Russian Volunteer Corps, the Freedom of Russia Legion focused on striking important targets within Russia's borders. Much like Artesh, these groups often blew up or set fire to rail and telecommunications infrastructure, including cell towers. They likely exploit the fact that many members hold Russian citizenship imposed on residents of Crimea after its annexation in 2014, which enables them to move across borders more easily and avoid immediate suspicion. In a sense, Putin's forced Russification policies in occupied Ukraine have come back to haunt him. What unfolded in November was essentially a war behind the more visible war. While global media focused on Russia's latest missile barrages, Ukraine's long-range drone strikes, and fragile peace talks overseen by the United States, Ukraine's shadow army of partisans, volunteers, and resistance fighters continued their work in the background. Their mission is not to deliver a single decisive blow that instantly ends the war. That is not realistic and not their purpose. Instead, they specialize in inflicting damage at critical moments, slowly draining Russia's military resources and scrambling the careful plans drawn up by Russian commanders. Near the front lines, resistance networks disrupt logistics, gather intelligence, and force Russian units to reassign soldiers away from combat missions, as Euromaidan press notes. Deep in the rear, attacks on railways, communications nodes, and energy infrastructure expose structural vulnerabilities that Moscow cannot fix without spreading its forces even thinner. This combination of stealthy sabotage and continuous pressure does more than hinder Russia's ability to wage war. It also sends a political message to Putin. It shows that opposition to his brutal invasion is broader and more deeply rooted than he wants to believe. For an authoritarian leader obsessed with control, that realization is chilling. The Freedom of Russia Legion, mentioned earlier, has become one of the most persistent irritants Putin faces. Earlier in November, its members, working with Ukrainian intelligence, carried out a series of high-risk attacks inside Russia that disabled locomotives and disrupted rail traffic. Those operations are covered in more detail in another video. If you want to learn more about how these strikes unfolded, you can watch that episode. If you found this examination of the war within the war insightful, make sure to subscribe to the Military Show for more in-depth analysis of the conflicts and covert campaigns that Putin has been unable to stop. Thank you for watching.